Ever get that feeling? You know, like when you're watching one of those true crime documentaries
Yeah.
and they're laying out the initial police report and you're already there at home thinking, wait, what?
How did they miss that?
Yeah, exactly. Like, how did they miss that? That's kind of where we're at with this deep dive, looking back at the death of Greg Fleniken.
So, just to recap, because obviously you've got all the research there in front of you. September 2010, Beaumont, Texas, a businessman from Louisiana named Greg Fleniken is found dead in his hotel room.
The MCM Elegante, right?
The MCM Elegante, that's the one. And it's, they find him there, half-eaten snacks, TV still on. Seems like just one of those,
Tragic but natural.
Tragic but natural kind of deals. And that's exactly what makes these cases so interesting, right? Because it just goes to show, no matter how obvious things might seem at first glance.
Yeah.
Got to dig a little deeper.
The initial police report, they pretty much, they thought they had it figured out. No forced entry, his wallet, cash, everything's undisturbed. Seems like an open and shut case of a heart attack.
Well, and that's where things get a little more complicated, I guess you could say, because that autopsy report, it paints a very different picture.
Right.
When you look at the extent of the internal injuries, we're talking broken ribs, a lacerated liver, there was a hole in his heart. That's not your typical heart attack.
No, it's more like, a car accident or something.
Exactly. That kind of trauma. It's just not something you'd typically associate with a sudden cardiac event.
So yeah, not so open and shut anymore. Instead of heart attack, it's ruled a homicide.
Right, which completely changes the direction of the investigation.
Because now they're looking for a killer. Right. And, that's where things get interesting with those electricians working next door to Greg.
They had reported, I think it was, a blown circuit, and it ended up affecting both of their rooms, which, naturally, the police are going to consider
of course,
a potential point of conflict.
Makes sense.
Because now you've got these guys, they've got a reason to have interacted with Greg, and suddenly they become persons of interest.
Yeah, you've got a homicide investigation. Yeah. And these guys are right there in the thick of it.
And what's really interesting is that they were, from what I understand, totally cooperative with the police.
Really?
Oh, yeah, they gave him an alibi, everything. And I think that's probably part of what led the initial investigation astray.
So we're left with a homicide, and what seems like, at least on the surface, a pretty straightforward explanation that just, it doesn't quite add up.
Yeah, it's a recipe for a cold case.
Exactly. And this is where Ken Brennan, you've heard of him, right?
Oh, yeah.
Private investigator, takes on all these cases, the ones that, nobody else can seem to crack.
Right.
He's the one they call, and in this case, it's Greg's widow, Susie. She's the one who brings him in.
Understandably so.
Oh, absolutely. She wants answers,
Yeah.
And at this point, the police are pretty much,
At a dead end.
Yeah, exactly.
But what's amazing about Brennan is how he approaches these cases. He comes in with a fresh set of eyes, goes through everything, the case files, interviews.
He doesn't miss a thing.
Exactly. And it's that attention to detail. And I think talking to Susie, going back over everything with her, that's where he picks up on something that everyone else had overlooked.
It's always something, right?
Yeah.
Like those little details.
Always.
What was it that got Brennan's gears turning?
It seems so insignificant, but when Susie was talking about Greg, she mentioned how he always kept their house, hotel rooms freezing.
Really?
Ice cold, she said. But then Brennan's looking back at the police report and sees that Greg's room, it was actually unusually warm when they found him.
See, now who hasn't stayed in a hotel room where the thermostat was a little,
A little up.
Yeah. A little off. Seems like no big deal.
Right, but you got to remember, we're talking about that blown circuit, the one that knocked out the power to Greg's room.
Right.
If he was so used to it being cold and the AC was off, wouldn't he have turned it back on?
Yeah, that makes sense. He would have noticed, right?
And this was before those fancy thermostats we have now, the ones that, automatically reconnect after a power outage.
So he would have had to actually get up and turn it back on himself.
Exactly.
Okay, so now we're talking, because that means he was up and about after whatever happened with the electricians.
It changes the whole timeline.
And then on top of that, you've got that cigarette.
Oh, yeah, the cigarette.
The one they found clutched in his left hand, which
we know. He was right-handed.
Right.
Again, just a small detail.
But to a guy like Brennan, these little things.
They're not just little things, they're clues.
They tell a story, don't they?
They absolutely do. And in this case, they were telling Brennan that what everyone thought happened probably didn't.
So what was he thinking? What did he make of the warm room, the cigarette, all of it?
He starts putting the pieces together, right? You've got the warm room, meaning Greg was up and about, the cigarette in his left hand, which isn't his dominant hand, and then his position, remember, they found him near the door.
Like he was trying to get out of there.
Exactly. And that's when it clicks for Brennan. He realizes that Greg was most likely attacked, but he didn't just lie down and die. He got up, tried to get to the door.
So it wasn't some kind of like planned attack where they came in and...
It was something else.
Something else entirely.
And this is where things get really interesting. Brennan, he catches wind of something, a rumor really, that one of the electricians had mentioned something to a coworker, something about a gunshot.
Wait, hold on. A gunshot in a hotel room and nobody heard it? You'd think that would be kind of hard to miss.
Right. But somehow no mention of it anywhere in the official reports. But Brennan, he's got that hunch now, and he's not letting it go. Gets in touch with Detective Scott Apple.
Okay.
And they agree to go back to the hotel, back to that room to see if they can find any evidence of a gunshot.
Months after the fact.
Yeah.
Talk about a long shot.
Oh, it was a long shot, for sure. But Brennan, he's not just wandering around hoping for the best. He's using those clues he's gathered, the warm room, the cigarette, trying to retrace Greg's steps.
Right. So he's basically using that information to try and figure out where the bullet might have gone.
Exactly. He's thinking, if we can follow the trajectory, maybe, just maybe, we can find something.
And what happened? Did they find anything?
They're going over that room with a fine-toothed comb, and just when they're about to give up hope, Brennan, he spots it.
What, the bullet?
Not the bullet itself, but something almost as telling. There's this patched up hole in the wall, like someone had tried to, I don't know, cover it up or something.
No way.
Yeah, and guess where it lined up with?
The electrician's room.
Bingo!
So all this time, the answer was right there, hidden in plain sight.
A single bullet hole telling a whole story.
And suddenly everything starts to make sense. The trajectory, the internal injuries, the fact that there wasn't a lot of blood at the scene.
Because it wasn't the kind of attack everyone initially thought. This wasn't a brutal beating. It was a gunshot wound, and the bullet, it had stayed inside Greg's body.
So, okay, we've gone from a mysterious death to a potential assault to now what? An accidental shooting.
That's what it's looking like, but there's still a lot of questions, like, who fired the gun?
Yeah.
And why try to cover it up?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like you can just, accidentally shoot a hole through a wall and just pretend it didn't happen.
Exactly, and that's where the investigation really zeroes in on those electricians.
Who, at this point, they're back in Wisconsin, right?
Yeah, long gone. But Brennan and Detective Apple, they fly all the way out there, ready to confront them with this new evidence. They bring in Tim Steinmetz first. And remember, he had lawyered up before, but this time things are different. They lay out everything, the evidence, the potential consequences, and it's clear that this time it's hitting him differently.
Yeah.
The weight of it all,
So what happens? Does he crack?
He does. Steinmetz, he breaks down, tells them that his coworker, Lance Mueller, had been, messing around with a gun, a 9mm Ruger, and it just went off.
Just like that.
Just like that. A single moment of carelessness and Greg Fleniken's life is over.
It's hard to believe that something so, so avoidable could have such devastating consequences.
And that's the real tragedy here, isn't it? If Mueller had just come forward, if they'd called for help, maybe Greg would have had a fighting chance.
Instead, they panicked.
And in doing so, they made the situation infinitely worse.
So what happened to Mueller? What was the,
He was charged with manslaughter, ended up serving 10 years in prison.
10 years, that's a long time. But also, a man lost his life.
It's a tough situation all around, and it really underscores the importance of, personal responsibility.
This whole case, it really makes you think, what starts as this open and shut case, a heart attack, turns into this whole thing.
And it just goes to show, things aren't always as they appear. It takes digging, asking the right questions, sometimes taking those leaps of faith, following those hunches.
I like with that cigarette, right. Brennan hadn't thought twice about that.
Exactly. It's those seemingly insignificant details. They can be the key to unlocking the truth. It's a good reminder to never underestimate the power of observation, of really paying attention.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's those little things, those seemingly insignificant details that make all the difference in the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.